The GlobalGRACE University of the Philippines National LGBTQ Writers Workshop took place in July of 2018. Focusing on the genre of poetry, it was the first in a 4-year series of competitive workshops devoted to creative writing by young Filipino LGBTQs. My paper seeks to examine the aesthetic strategies deployed in the Anglophone poetry suites from the workshop under the rubric of post-confessionalism. This critical term refers to a kind of self-aware poesis or making in which the confessional I, the anguished self, who expresses a personal shame, is understood to be the performative effect of the repetitive citation of the confessional norm. And it is this very performativity that produces the illusion of autobiographical self-presence. Hence, post-confessionalism is a deliberate kind of autobiographical writing that understands the confessional lyric in terms not of experiential accuracy, but rather of the artistically realized simulation of the supposedly faithful relationship between life and art. As a literary form, the post-confessional poem willfully aspires to create powerful personal fictions or myths, in this case of the LGBTQ self, couched in lyric expressions that may be seen to oscillate between timidity on one hand and excess on the other. A reading of the poems will suggest the possible reasons why these are the expressions being favored by young Filipino LGBTQ poets today. First, allow me to describe the conceptual parameters of the GlobalGRACE Creative Writing Workshop. GlobalGRACE is an international arts and research consortium sited across 5 Global South countries and the United Kingdom. It is funded by the UKRI through Goldsmiths University of London. This consortium aims to celebrate gendered and sexual cultures of equality by supporting intuitions and practices of resistance and justice, and by championing creative communities. The Philippine component of GlobalGRACE features verbal expressivity and forms of textual performances by young Filipino LGBTQ individuals who are beginning or aspiring writers. In the Philippines, writing is especially crucial to the question of equality because, as an ideal, equality presupposes the viability of a literate and comparative imagination, one that is able to moderate the institutional predisposition of the oral mind and abstract out of the specificities of lived experience and think in categorical terms. After only a century of public education, the Philippines remains enduringly oral by and large. Many of its problems may be traced to the unevenness of its population's literacy, which must exceed the merely functional and become archival or profound if it should ever leave the clannish and regional mentality of its archipelagic origin and truly cohere as a nation, and commit itself to the scriptural stability of democratic aspirations. On the other hand, the Creative Writing Workshop has doubtless been a major moving force in the development of Philippine literatures, chiefly in the dominant languages of English and Filipino. As a pedagogical paradigm, and drawing from the new critical perspective that occasioned it in the West, the Creative Writing Workshop claims to be ideology-free, focusing strictly, as its scrutiny supposedly does, on the formal elements of the given text, and bracketing out of the analysis biographical and other extrinsic concerns, like the authors as well as the readers, gender, class, sexual, religious, ethnic, etc. positionalities. This immanentist approach has of course been long discredited and supplanted in the history of literary theory and criticism, but strangely enough, in the creative writing establishment, it has stubbornly persisted, where it has been left generally unquestioned and intact. The Philippine LGBTQ Writers Workshops seek to interrogate and rectify this practice, which has most certainly not succeeded in suspending value judgments in the selection, appraisal, and mentorship of creative manuscripts, particularly where they are about and rooted in eccentric, dissident, and extra-normative experiences. The 10 fellows to the 2018 workshop were selected from an open competition that saw more than 100 submissions from across 5 Philippine languages. Because more than half of the total submissions were in English, 5 slots were given to the most qualified Anglophone poets, 4 of whom identify as gay, the 5th identified as a gender-fluid bisexual woman. The tradition of non-heteronormative poetry in the Philippines is relatively new. An inaugural moment for it may be said to be the publication of Ladlad, a 4-volume series of Philippine gay writing that came out in the last 2 decades. This tradition has seen themes like coming out, relationships, desire, domesticity, spirituality, romantic love, bisexuality, aging, and mortality, all written in the personal or autobiographical register, which critics of contemporary lyric poetry have often called confessional. Confessionalism is a term commonly ascribed to the lyric poems of certain American poets from the 1950s and 1960s. It is important to note that, as with the modernists or romantics before them, these poets rarely referred to themselves or their writings by this term. Confessional poetry has been described as evincing 3 important characteristics: the frank unbosoming of a trauma, the interweaving of private and public knowledges, and the use of an intimate and conversational tone. The first element, anguish, is probably the most crucial. Indeed, the first poets identified with this mode of writing all suffered from a variety of adversities: sad childhoods, dysfunctional family relationships, failed marriages, nervous breakdowns, substance abuse, to name a few. The American critic Irving Howe once famously declared that the confessional poem would seem to be one in which the writer speaks to the reader, telling him without the mediating presence of imagined event or persona something about his life, unquote. The most crucial part of this definition is, of course, the word scene. Indeed, the confessional poem isn't so much a poem in which the poet himself or herself speaks about his or her life, but rather a poem which convinces the reader that it is indeed the poet himself or herself who is speaking about his or her life. We can therefore compare confessionalism to the creation of the illusion of 3-dimensional space by realist painters. Truthfulness in this kind of poetry isn't about the truth per se, but rather about an illusion of truth, which the poet creates by speaking candidly about shameful and traumatic experiences. The crucial point to remember is that confessionalism in lyric poetry is not a function of mimesis, but rather of poesis, which is both invention and representation all at once. We may call poems that knowingly and persistently perform this function as post-confessional, hence. As a practice, post-confessionalism is distinguished by the willful consistency in poem after poem of the confessional tone and the confessional style. This consistency invests these otherwise contrived texts with an authentically immediate and confessional personality. Reading these poems, one gets the idea of a self-same speaking subject whose speech comes across as an unmediated articulation of a deeply personal truth. It is this articulation that generates the myth of the autobiographical self. Like its predecessor, the post-confessional lyric tends to be written in free verse, a form that accommodates everyday speech and easily allows the reader to enter the poem's private world. Unlike closed and regularly metered verse, free verse can better impart to the reader the illusion of pure and unbridled feeling. It makes obvious sense to use the rubric of confessionalism to talk about queer poetry. To the degree that a confessional poem unbosoms a painful truth, we can say that queer lyrics are already by definition confessional. Whatever else they do, these texts confess what continues to be a difficult and shameful truth. In our homophobic and transphobic world, a most troubling gendered or sexual truth about their makers. The poetry suites of the LGBTQ poets being considered for this study are post-confessional precisely in this respect. They enact their authors' gendered and sexual positionalities, both textually, through their work's representational content, and extra-textually, by the performativity of their having been submitted to this politically identified workshop. Hence, they evince varying degrees of self-disclosure, which may be reckoned in terms of the polarity of timidity on one hand and excess on the other. For the most part, the fellows to this workshop approach the subject of self-disclosure indirectly, through the use of personae and stories that do not so much represent or describe as evoke their identities as queer subjects. In other words, while tapping into the formal and thematic affordances of confessional poetry, they nonetheless demur against its more readily recognizable features, by thickening or attenuating their poem's representational contents. In either case, the resultant articulations can be read post-confessionally as queer, despite or precisely because of the stylistic strategies of circumvention that they perform. Since there will be no time to go through the suites of all the 5 poetry fellows, allow me to bring up the cases of only 2. Mariel Alonso's poetry suite is characterized by the excessive use of a metonymic structure, in which images progress not so much because they are logical on a metaphorical or deep level, but because they are related on the level of surface association. Reading them, therefore, necessitates that one keep reminding oneself what the poem's central situation is, as the verbal associations can often meander into all sorts of directions. An emblematic example would be her poem Playing Passover, that's the title, which describes a scene in which impoverished young Lumad or native girls from the coast are daring to play games normally played by boys, in this case basketball. This itself registers a queer theme or observation, but the language of the text, in being overly metonymic, dilutes the mimetic commitment, blurs the solidity of the narrative image, and renders the poem somewhat mystifying. Alonso's text ends with the idea that the girls are able to get away with their gender transgression because they will all use the, and I quote, alibi, that the, and I quote, forbidden sounds, unquote, of their boyish mirth are simply those of a backstrap loom. Weaving being a traditional task that many Lumad girls are consigned to doing. The rest of Alonso's collection may be read along more or less the same stylistic lines. The poems are not linear in their narrative, rather they are imagistically productive and often excessively so. We can say that the simplicity of the various stories of precarity and suffering that they tell, of a seaside scavenger, of an overseas contract worker, of a wife caught in a loveless marriage, of a girl raped by the parish priest, gets all complicated and in a sense obfuscated by the excessive use of associative and disparate imagery. And yet it is also the expanded notion of the suffering self that supersedes solipsism and homes outward to gesture toward a larger sense of community that renders the collection's vision poignantly memorable and post-confessional. While the global history of queer aesthetics does offer as a possible explanation the idea and practice of camp, this is a sophisticated reading that we are loath to deploy to make sense of this collection, written as it has been by a young bisexual poet from the homophobic southern Philippines. The more likely explanation is that the strategy of hyperbole presents an entry point for someone like the poet to begin to confess, that is to say, affirm herself in verse, in a language that elides easy judgment and condemnation. On the other extreme of the self-disclosure continuum are the poetry suites by fellows that exhibit what we might call a kind of verbal reticence, exemplified by a minimalist approach to poetry's mimetic commitment, particularly in regard to the use of proper as opposed to common nouns. We cite here, as example, the representational timidity to be found in the poems of Thomas Leonard Shaw, whose first national workshop this was. A clear strength of Shaw's collection is its sense of calm and tranquility. This, despite the fact that what it talks about are tumultuous things. Earthquakes, tempests, and the disasters of broken families and forfeited love. Shaw's poems evince a palpably atmospheric effect. The hazy landscapes and waterscapes they limn seek to articulate what the speaker feels. We can say that the poet mostly succeeds in sustaining this dramatic indirection in the entire collection. Characteristic of the suite's formal articulation, however, is its over-reliance on abstraction. There is simply an absence of specificity in almost every other poetic situation or narrative thread in the pieces. This bids us to consider the likely possibility, given the obvious youngness of the work, that what we are seeing isn't so much artful understatement as self-defensive timidity, a kind of verbal circumspection that may well be a queer stance, especially for beginning and understandably reluctant queer writers. All too subtly, Shaw's poems sketch out in rather broad strokes the stories of a troubled family, of an emotionally distant father and an alienated son, of a failed and possibly unreciprocated romance, of coastal leavings and goings, but these are all fleshless and boneless, devoid of the details upon which a work of imagination must rely if only to be real. The avoidance of using proper nouns, of being particular and concrete, of engaging in any indwelling rumination is clearly a function not only of a lack of discursive confidence, only to be expected of the young, but also of a fear of self-disclosure itself, which cannot just be about the self, but also of the self's relationships, which is to say, its significant others. Needless to say, in the Philippines, the heteronormative institution of the family still looms large over the consciousness of queer people. The desire expressed in Shaw's poems is the desire not to be vulnerable, something easily relatable given the fact that by their very truth, queer subjects are already uniquely vulnerable to begin with. Even grief cannot be entirely indulged in, for that would mean submitting to it. This is a grief that cannot, of course, be separated from the moral and social suffering that the queer speaker undergoes just by being queer. The poetry suites of the three other fellows all may be read as negotiating the same dynamic between timidity and excess, although one of them, Nico Pablos, seems to have struck the finest balance, if only because its poems are more pointedly and self-reflexively post-confessional. While Pablo's poems dramatize the persona's struggle to be both queer and Catholic, they also situate this otherwise private struggle alongside public discourses and knowledges, like mythology, history, popular culture, and even the hard sciences. In this suite, personal anecdotes are often complicated and sometimes framed from the perspective of reflective commentary or even theory, which exceeds the inwardness of the confessional form. This craft-related insight regarding the affordances offered by post-confessionalism, which can and does permit the narrativizing or the mythologizing of the lyric self, if only to make it easier to at once truthfully and imaginatively speak about it, was one of the most useful lessons that came out of that workshop. While it's true that all art aspires to universality, it's truer that in art most crucially, whose statements are not propositional but are rather embodied and evocative, the path to the universal necessarily happens through the particular. It's the championing of queer particularities expressed through imaginative constructs that these LGBTQ workshops aim to achieve. By contrast, it is their denial, rationalized by new criticism's falsely humanist ideology and enshrined at the heart of the old creative writing paradigm, that proves most injurious of all. Unchallenged, the aesthetic regime of new criticism privileges heterosexuality as the only position that has the right to dream of becoming universal, on one hand. On the other, its universalizing imperative conveniently subsumes the difference of queer suffering into the anguished sameness of the human condition, in the process neglecting the critique that's implicit in all anti-heteronormative texts. Needless to say, the Philippine Project for Global Grace seeks to supersede new criticism and all other forms of irresponsible formalism in general, and to realize and enact the ideal of cultures of gender and sexual equality through the nurturing and promotion of Filipino LGBTQ literature. Allow me to end with a reading of one of Pablo's poems. His collection would later on win a top prize at the Palanca Awards, the Philippines' premier literary competition. Lover's Synecdoche by Nico Pablo. To sing your bones is to release you, long before I have even kept a single bead of sweat. Memory is a wishbone snapping, two clavicles engulfing the wilderness sewn between these blankets. I forget the gristle of guilt. I am nakedness of want. I am virgin's rapture. I am an account of deep exploration. Drawn string of Cupid's bow, suckle on the fruit of a rounded lip, skim an incisor, film of spit, the ghost of soap haunting slope of a neck. How I have held you, Wrists crossed, the nooks under your armpits, pelvis upon lumbar. The body of fear, I feel his rib cage, the uninvited partner. We, victims of solitude, on a quest to wholeness, we cause each other to glisten. Thank you.